Welcome to our second conference of the Foreign Translation Lecture Series, our forum to discuss the latest trends in translation, interpreting, and localization studies. Last week we had our first presenter, Johansson, who spoke about mental conditioning for interpreters, and today it's my pleasure to welcome our invited guest, and Johansson, who kindly accepted our invitation to come to talk to us about how translation in the European Parliament makes multilingual democracy possible. Kent, a couple of things about Kent. I could talk probably for a long while, but just a short summary. He worked as a project manager for commercial translation and information management projects in Sweden. And in '97 he moved to Luxembourg, where he began his career in the public translation services of the European Union. After 10 years in the European Parliament Planning Service, coordinating, improving and upgrading their complex machinery, translation machinery, he works now coordinating with the translation services of the other European institutions, as well as cooperating with the language services of other international organizations. He's a co-chair of the university's contact group of the International Annual Meeting on Language Arrangements, Documentation, and Publications. And he speaks Swedish, English, German, French, and Luxembourgish, which will have to talk to me about it because I didn't know anything about that before looking at it in Wikipedia. So Ken will be presenting for 1 hour, after which there will be an opportunity for questions, 1 hour or perhaps a little less than that. I know that the topic that he's going to cover is of interest to most of you, so we're very lucky, you will agree with me that we're very lucky to have him here today. So without further ado, please help me to welcome Ken Johansson.
Well, thank you everyone. I'm quite happy to be in Monterey. I've been here since Saturday now, so I've been adapting a bit to the time and to the jet lag. And with a name like Johansson, you have to be Swedish, and that's my nationality. Though I live and work in Luxembourg since more than 14 years already, working for the European Parliament. And exactly what I do we'll be seeing a bit when I describe what the translation services of the European Parliament is doing. We'll see more or less how long time it takes, and then we're open to questions. So please don't forget, if you think of something, please ask questions afterwards so that we don't miss out on anything. This lecture today will be very practical. The idea is to look a bit at how do we actually manage to work with 23 languages, because we have 23 official working languages, and the question is, how do you deal with a machinery like that? I think it said on the small poster that we're talking about 506 linguistic combinations. If you start combining English, French, German, Swedish, Danish, and you come up to 506 combinations. And we're going to look a bit about today, how are we organized, what tools do we have, how can we cope with that kind of organization and complexity in what we're doing. And we'll also come to a bit of why I've ended up here in Monterey these days. We'll talk a bit about that also a bit later on. I will start with a very boring slide, but I have a purpose with that. Okay. There we go. The organization, I mean, it's obligatory, you have to have it here. Just to show you how we are organized. The European Parliament are organized by Directorate General. So you will have a Directorate General, short DG, for internal policies. You will have another one for external policies. You will have one for infrastructure, one for personnel, and one for translation. So we have a DG translation. Short, we always talk about DG trad, so trad from traduction from the French. as well as we have a DG interpretation, who deals with interpretation questions. Each DG is led by a Director General, which is a British lady in our case for the moment. And under her, she has two directorates. It's a Directorate A and Directorate B. Directorate A is Support and Technological Services, which means everything which is supporting translation. You have 4 units. I've just put in the abbreviations to show you what's in there. It was too long to write the names. ITS, that information technological support. So that's everything which has to do with our computers. Everything from hardware, to make sure that everybody has a computer on their desk. They're doing the help desking. They're also developing certain software tools, internal tools, which we need. Very important unit. I'll come back a bit about the technology and how important that is for us. ETU, that's External Translation Unit. We are quite heavy users of freelance translation, so external translation. And we have a unit who deals with all the practical parts of this. That means they are the ones who do the call for tenders, to recruit the agencies. We'll come in, we talk a bit more about freelance. So they are managing the contracts, managing the daily contacts with the agencies, sending out the jobs, receiving the jobs, etc. There's something called the pre-trad, or pre-translation unit, which is fairly new. The idea with pre-translation is that for certain jobs, we have 23 official languages. So if you got in a job which was supposed to be translated into all the other languages, certain of the first steps which were done in the translation units were almost identical. And the idea was that, wait a minute, why don't we pull out these tasks, instead of doing them 22 times, let's do it in one unit, doing it once, and making this available to all the units. This is talking about preparing the translation memories, looking for reference material, possibly terminology, etc. Pre-translation. It's been a huge success, and everybody's very happy with that. We also have, as the fourth part here, a small training unit who deals with the internal training needs in DG translation for our translators and for the other staff. On the other side, we come to the core business, Directorate B, which is translation and terminology, where we have our 22 translation units. And wait a minute, somebody might say here, didn't he just say we have 23 official languages? Why do you only have 22 language units? Simple fact is that our English and Irish units are merged, or it's one unit. Irish is a language which became official in 2007. We are still in a transition phase because it's not that easy to find translators who translate into Irish on the market, so we have a very limited number of them, and we are not yet obliged to translate everything into Irish. So that means that the 3 Irish translators we have are integrated into the English unit, and they call it the Irish and English translation unit. The good thing about that is that since most Irish are also very good with English, if they don't have anything to translate into Irish, they can be used to translate into English, which is a bit of an exception on how we do things, but that's always done for Irish. We have a terminology coordination unit, which we also come back to, and we have a fairly important unit called planning, and that's actually where I spent quite many years. The planning unit is where everything which is supposed to be translated first comes to the planning unit. Planning unit are the ones who finally decide on deadlines, on priorities, whether a text should be translated in-house or go externally. All these hands are in the colleagues of planning. They have certain rules or guidelines which they follow. We'll have a look at a bit of what it contains. Just to say that this is really the core. Here everything comes in. Planning is not very popular. I can talk from my own experience, because you have the client on one side and you have the translation units on one side. So the client, whatever it now, it's a political group or it's a committee secretariat, they send it, I need this for the day after tomorrow. Okay, and planning negotiates and say, well, hold it, let's say a week at least, depending on the text, etc. Planning might accept it and send it with a week's deadline to the translation units, and they come back and say, are you mad? A week? We need at least 2 weeks to do this. So planning are just in between both parts, and it's a good place to get an overview of how the organization works and which language units you can, make sure they will finish on time and others not. You know which clients are a bit more difficult and disciplined, others are better disciplined than others, etc. So this is really a core thing, because as you will see a bit later, we do translate quite a lot over a year, so we need somebody who keeps track of all these things. Now, you have 2 small boxes on the top to the left and the right. Those are 2 units who are placed directly under the authority of the Director General. One is called General Coordination. General Coordination deals with everything which has to do with, let's say, human resources. If you need to recruit a new translator, they are the one who make the contacts with the personnel department of the Parliament in whole. Finances, we for instance have to pay our freelance translators, so we have people who check the finances, make sure everything gets paid and prepare the budget, etc. We also, as I said, we have a lot of technical tools which has to be paid, and that is always done in general coordination. So you have human resources, you have finances, and you have things like buildings. Make sure that every translator and assistant that they actually have an office to sit in. So they are the ones who have the contact with the DG infrastructure to make sure that we have enough offices. For instance, for the moment we are about to recruit Croatian translators, because as some of you might know, Croatia will become a new member state of the European Union as of next year, which means that we are slowly starting to build up a Croatian translation unit. And then it's of course our general coordination who have to go to our big buildings department and say, as of next year we need another 30 offices. Could you please arrange that so that we have somewhere to put them? And that's one of their parts. So general coordination, very little to do directly with translation, but they have to make sure that everything around it works. On the other side, you find a unit called Multilingualism and External Relations, and that's actually where I'm working right now. It's a unit to have a very different tasks. One of them is everything which is called statistics and performance management, performance indicators. This is something which in public sector you don't really like talking about. There's a generation shift, but we have to talk about this. We have to show a bit how much do we produce, what are the gains, etc., etc. Today, for instance, if we want to buy, for our translation memories, we need new servers. This was the case a couple of years ago. And I don't remember, there was a pretty large sum which needed to be invested. And you go to the budget committee of the Parliament and say, I need a couple of €100,000 to buy new servers. And they would look at you and say, okay, please show us that the use of translation memory is a gain. You have to be able to show how much you produce, how much you do, how much you reuse, etc., etc. This is very much, we know that, contrary to a lot of the colleagues' inner feelings on what, how it should work, but this is, we have to show it, and it gets more and more. For instance, if a translator in one of our translator units retires, let's say, in the Spanish unit, one translator retires. We do not automatically get that post replaced. We have to show that the Spanish unit's productivity motivates the fact that that post is renewed. So if you have all the other units have a higher productivity, they might not decide not to replace the Spanish translator, instead expect everybody else to be up there. So this is quite important, and we're working very hard the last couple of years to get the figures right, get the systems right to give us that information, because that is not automatic. So that's one part of what we do. Unfortunately, I'm not at all involved in that part. The other side we do, and that's more what we here call external relations, is that we, first of all, between the European institutions, so if we talk about the European Parliament, you have the European Commission, you have the European Council, you have the Court of Justice, the Court of Auditors, you have a number of European institutions, each with their own translation service. And there is then a cooperation between all these services, and that's what we do in our unit, is to try to coordinate and follow all these projects going on. And it's projects, for instance, on many fields. We'll have a look at a couple of later on when it's on terminology, on translation memories, etc. So that's really close cooperation where we try to actually gain experience or make things more effective by doing it together. If we draw the circle a bit further out, we also, I wouldn't call it cooperate, but I would call it network, with other international organizations with translation services, or language services, there's also interpretation, which is called, you tried to pronounce it before, MIIS.m4v. MIIS.m4v is a stupid abbreviation, I agree, but it is the organization which brings together basically all international organizations with language services. So we're talking about the different European institutions, we're talking about the different UN duty stations and agencies. You have other organizations in there like the Red Cross, the OECD, the World Trade Organization, and so on. We meet once a year to discuss problems and issues and experiences. But as I said, it's more networking than real cooperation. It's too difficult. The organizations are very different. Number of languages are different. How we work is very different. So that makes a difference. Anyway, in this cooperation, there is something called the University Contacts Group, where you put a number of international organizations on one side and a number of universities on one side. And that's actually where I've ended up here, because since March this year, I am chairing this group together with Perry Olson, which is a university representative. So you have one co-chair from an international organization and another one from a university side. We are now leading this group together and trying to do some good projects out of there. We'll be discussing that this week. And that's really why I ended up here today. Anyway, so the multilingualism unit is a bit, we do a bit of everything out there. We also concentrate on awareness raising or outreach, we call it. For certain languages we had problems getting enough qualified translators and interpreters, so we do, to certain countries we do a lot of information activity, career events, etc. etc. Now, this whole package, 1,200 people, more or less, out of which some 750 are translators. For the European Parliament, all the the whole translation service is based in Luxembourg. And that's the reason why I speak a bit of Luxembourgish. I won't bother you with that though. Some of the other European institutions have their translation services in Brussels, or like the European Commission, they have one part in Brussels and one part in Luxembourg. So these two cities have some 250 kilometers between them, so the distance isn't that big. Now, why did I show you this boring picture? Just to show you that the core business, the translation, is just one part. When you have a big organization like this, there is the necessity for a lot of support services is there. And therefore you have this big organization, even though translation is just one very important part of it, but you need the other things working around it. That's where, I mean, some people tend to have an idea to think that we have 750 translators sitting in a big room and we just go around and give them things, but that's not how it works. You need to have it on another level. Okay, how does a language unit work, or how big is it? For most languages, we have between 30 to 35 translators per language. Some actually a bit more. I talked to a Slovak translator the other day and they are down to 26. Some units have a bit more, and that's what I'm talking about relay languages. That is, in our case, English, French, and German, who are a bit bigger. They have some 40 to 44 translators. And I'll explain why in a second. We also have something which we call translation assistants, which actually in the old days used to be called secretaries, but today they are working much more on the IT side. They prepare the documents, they even work with the translation memories to prepare a package for the translator. When the translator is ready, it gives it back to the assistant, and they will format the text and make sure it's ready for delivery. So they have a lot more advanced task than they had once upon a time when they basically were typing whatever the translators were dictating. Relay languages. The concept is that for certain language combinations, we simply don't have translators who can do them. Up to 2004, the European Union had 11 official languages. At that point in time, you had in each language unit somebody who could translate directly out of all the other languages. So you would have somebody in the Swedish unit who can translate from Portuguese, the German unit who could translate from Greek, etc. You covered all the combinations directly. I think there was one combination which they had problems with, and that was Finnish into French. But that was rare. So that was the basic principle. Now, in 2004, the European Union grew by another 10 member states, and with 9 new languages. So we went from 11 to 20 languages. So we basically doubled the number of languages. Our translation budget did not go up, so each translation unit did not grow. So we had the same number of translators, but we still had to cover a lot more languages. And you saw in the beginning I said that we had 506 linguistic combinations we cover today. With 11 languages before 2004, that was 110 combinations. So, good deal. In 2004, with the enlargement and 20 languages, we went to 380 combinations. So somebody had to come up with something, because we couldn't cover all languages directly anymore in all language units. Because we wouldn't, we would have to quadruple the staff basically to be able to do that, which was not in question. Even if we would have decided to do that, certain language combinations we would never have found translators out there. I don't know how many out there who could actually do, let's say, Maltese into Estonian directly. I mean, there are odd language combinations which we wouldn't cover even if we would like to. So, the idea that people come up with was to use a system of relay languages. You will also hear the terminology pivot languages. And then using our 3 big languages, which is English, French, and German, saying, okay, in these 3 language units, we should cover all languages, or more or less all languages. So they trained their staff, which for that reason is a bit bigger than the other languages, to cover all languages. This means that if I now get a text, I took the example Maltese into Estonian. If I get a Maltese text today which needs to be translated into Estonian, it would be sent first to the English unit, they would translate it into English, and the Estonian colleagues would use the English text. So you translate in 2 steps using a pivot or a relay system. Which might not be ideal, but it works, let's put it that way. Actually, sometimes it's even of an advantage, because if something is unclear in the source text, in the original, the English unit, in this case translating it, might have solved that problem before it goes out to the other languages, so you have a better translation in the end. But this is how it works, this is how it will continue to work. I will show you a bit of figures later on, that it's not for every text we need to do it, but this is the principle. Important to know is that we're not forcing anybody to use it. That means that if come back to the example Maltese via English into Estonian, if by chance there would be somebody in the Estonian unit who actually translates for Maltese, they would be free to do it directly from the original text without going via the hero. I think that basically covers this part. Now, let's go on to the figures then, which I promised. In 2010, we translated in the European Parliament some 1,700,000 pages. The figure as such is not important, I just want to show you it's a lot. That's the basic concept of this slide. Source languages, that's quite an interesting part. It's source languages, I mean, in which languages are the texts we get from translation. And as you will see, in 2010, English was 51% of all originals we got were in English. 16% in French and 6% in German. That's the three big languages. Which means that in the cases we were just talking about relay translation, actually it's just some 20–25% where we need to use it, because all units are expected to be able to translate from at least these three languages. I could continue down the chain, but these are really the big ones. If you go down, the next would be Spanish, Italian, Dutch, coming up with around 3%, all of them. At the very bottom you would find languages like in Maltese, even Swedish, etc. Very few texts which are written in those which we get for translation. Now, somebody is thinking here, and if you know the European Union a bit, you might start thinking, wait a minute, which countries are there in the European Union which have English as their mother tongue? So, English, the UK, United Kingdom, and Ireland, where it's an official language. And that's it. Now, they don't make out 51% of the population in the European Union, and they do not make out the 51% is not, our members of the European Parliament are not British or Irish. So how do we come to these 51%? Let's say that MEP, as members of the European Parliament, are elected members, are supposed to write a report for the Parliament on something, that's fisheries. To his side, and this member, let's call him, let's say he's Portuguese. And to help him, he would get a staff administrator from the Fisheries Committee. This administrator might be Finnish. There would probably be somebody from the political group of the member, so the party of the member, another administrator who would also like to help out or make sure. And to make it even easier, let's make him Greek. So now we have a group of one Portuguese, one Greek and one Finnish who have to work together and have to try to write the text and come up with a report together. Today, when they have to find a common language to do that, it very often ends up being English. And that's why we end up with figures with 50%, or some years it's been even more. Okay, that sounds very practical. However, we have a slight problem with this, is that what we get here is English written by people who do not have English as a mother tongue. Which usually works out quite well, and sometimes it does not work out quite well. And some originals we get is quite frankly crap, if the word is allowed. And it's not, you know, it's not understandable. You can read in it and you see, okay, that was probably somebody from France who wrote this text, because you see how it's written, that it's not, or Portuguese or Greek or whatever. So it's not properly. This has forced us to start something we call an editing service. That means that a part of our English unit goes through, not all, but the most important English originals, all those which are to become legislation at some point in time. They go through them and edit the English original before it goes to translation. And this is now becoming so much that we're actually creating an editing unit, as they already have in the Commission, for instance, which is coming up. So this is the reason for English being so much. This is mainly a problem with English, to a lesser extent in French, but in particular for English we have a lot of text written in English which are not written by people who have English as a mother tongue. Goes for me. I mean, internally in the administration we have two working languages in the parliament, and it's English and French, which means that when I have to write anything, it's usually also in English, and it will end up. But that's not because it usually doesn't get translated, it's for internal use, so that's how it works out. But when something, for instance, becomes legislation, it's quite important that it's really, really correct. Okay, at the end I mentioned something called multilingual documents. And this is something, 6%, it's a pretty high figure. Multilingual documents, I mean, is when we get originals for translation, where you have more than one language in the same document, which is not unusual. You might have one part which is written in English and a second part which is written in Portuguese. For all possible reasons, we could have, if you have a report and people want to make changes, they, looking for a word here, they put amendments to this text. And it's usually the case that the member, if it's a Portuguese member, he might do his amendment in Portuguese. The Swedish member might propose something in Swedish, etc. They are actually put into one document which is then translated. Which turns into a bit of a problem logistically on our side, because you often don't find the same translator who can translate the whole document, so you have to split it per language. This also gives a lot of our CAT tools, our technical tools, a lot of problems, because this was not foreseen, to put it that way. So this is, I think this is very specific for the European Parliament. You won't find that as much in the European Commission or anything like that, but we do have this multilingual documents. Okay. Now, how do we manage this? I told you before that the planning units had a difficult task, and they decided on a lot of things like deadlines, priorities, documents to translate or not. Just wanted to mention that we have something which is called the Code of Conduct on Multilingualism for the European Parliament. It covers both translation and interpretation. This document is adopted by the Bureau of the Parliament, and the Bureau is the highest authority. It's the President and the Vice President. So it's adopted actually on proposal from us, but by the political authority. So everybody is bound by this document, and those rules are in there. Planning can enforce them by saying, okay, this is the highest authority. We haven't come up with this idea. You have to go to the President of the Parliament if you don't like them. That's the advantage. And it gives a general framework. It doesn't cover everything in detail, but still it tries to give some hints on how to deal with certain things. Like, what documents are to be translated, and into what languages. You will find rules in there to say, for instance, that an individual member of Parliament cannot send anything to translation. If he writes a report, he will send it through a committee secretariat. If there is somebody, if he tries to translate an article or something like that, we are not supposed to translate that, and we can say no. And it's clearly in this text to say, no, I'm sorry, we cannot translate that. Certain texts, there is a decision to say, okay, we're not translating into all languages. And this is, you will also find it in this document that says that documents from a parliamentary delegation, for instance, is only translated into 2 languages and not into all languages. It's all in there. Priorities. Very important. Certain clients are more important than others. We have a list where the President of the Parliament is on the top. So if he sends out something to translation, he'll get it yesterday. Never mind if during the night he'll get it when he wants. And then you have a list going down through different categories in the Parliament, and you end up at the very last. I think the trade unions of the Parliament have the last priority of the list. So that's where it comes up. So that's basically helps also to do it. However, and that's where the colleagues in planning need what the Germans call Fingerspitzgefühl, a bit of the right feeling for it. Because you might have a document from the President's office, who's top priority, but the document itself is in fact not that important. On the other hand, you might have something from the trade unions, which actually is quite important. And there you need to sometimes be able to negotiate and see, well, well, couldn't this wait another 2 days or something like that? So they have to be able to feel this. But anyway, the general guidelines is in the Code of Conduct. That goes also for deadlines for the document. For deadlines, there are not rules for all documents, but there are for certain types of documents in the legislative process. How many minimal days do we need for the deadlines, etc. Now, and this is where it makes it very interesting to work in the European Parliament, because we are a political organization. And never mind if it says 8 working days in the Code of Conduct for a report or whatever, or a resolution. In the political game in the European Union, sometimes if the Parliament wants to make its voice heard, there are rules, for instance, the Parliaments have to reply within 30 days to the Council, the Commission, or something. Now, if we get this text only 5 days before that deadline, so the question is, what do we do? Do we say, I'm sorry, 8 working days, forget it, and the Parliament's voice is not heard, which would bring us in a lot of problems. So we end up having to translate things with very short deadlines for political reasons, even though the rules say something else. And this is just tell you, it's a big problem, because we end up with very short deadlines sometimes, but we cannot really say no for everything. There are other things we can say no and say, okay, forget it, we won't have it tomorrow, you will have it next week, whatever, but it's very, very short. External translation. There are also some guidelines in here on text to be translated internally by our staff translators and on the outside by freelance agencies. So there are rules on translations which should be done, documents which should be translated in-house, and other documents which can be translated freelance. It's also in here to give a guideline. However, that also depends a lot on the workload for the moment. If our in-house translators are not that busy, you might say, okay, this document should have gone freelance, but we'll give it in-house to keep our translators busy instead. So there's a certain flexibility on this. When did I start? Okay. Now, freelance. I told you we use freelance quite a lot. For us, we need to when we recruit freelance translators, and in our case at Parliament only agencies, we are must use call for tenders, public procurement. We are not allowed to go out there and say, Mr. Olsen, you're a good translator, wouldn't you work as a freelancer for us? We're not allowed to do that. We have to launch call for tenders, a procurement procedure to make people give offers, etc. Heavy procedure, but that's how our financial regulations are written. We're not always very happy with it when we see the colleagues in the UN have much easier ways to recruit freelance, but we have to do that. The Parliament has chosen only to have contracts with big agencies, but I said this is a choice, you could do it differently. For the moment the Parliament said, okay, I want basically 1 contract per language, and they are supposed to cover everything, all language combinations, and they are required to accept everything we send them within limits. Which means that we have outsourced a bit of the administration on this part, but that is the situation as it is right now, and that can change. Just to show you that we use a lot of freelance. So 40% of everything we translated, so 40% of the figures you saw on the previous page is translated by freelancers. So that's quite a big figure, and we expect it to go up in the coming years, in fact. Now, we do have some problems with the freelance, that the quality is sometimes a bit varying, and we're trying to work with our agencies on this problem, but in principle we work with them, and we will have to continue to do that. Now, a more interesting part, technology. I used this picture on another presentation I did also, and so we say, well, isn't this a bit too dramatic? You have a robotic arm holding the earth in their hands, ready to crush it. Well, actually, I don't think it's too much exaggeration, in fact, because you can just see if our case, working very heavily, very technological environment, if the servers go down, we can close and send everybody home. I mean, nothing works anymore, so we have to make sure that it does, and otherwise we stop it. Now, technology is not only translation memories or machine translation. In an organization like ours, something like workflow is also important. What I mean with workflow, that means that nobody comes with a translation request and gives us a paper saying we want this translated. They, of course, in an application which we call JEPRO, they do the request for translation in that application. Planning receives it in the same application and puts in the additional information on deadlines, etc. in that, and then it's sent on to the translation units, who have their internal workflow of preparations, of translation, of revision, or whatever might be doing it. So that is an important part of what we do, in fact, is workflow to make sure it works correctly. MIIS stands for European Advanced Multilingual Information System. Just want to mention it because this is something which is very, very useful to us. To me, it's a big black box, I must admit. We could call it an interinstitutional translation memory. That means that the European Parliament, the European Commission, European Council, etc., we have one big translation memory where almost all translations are stored in this common translation memory. Because when it, and you will see that on the next slide, certain documents come back to us and haunt us. And it starts all in the Commission, so it's very useful that the other institutions are involved in this. So we have a common translation memory which is called MIIS. Another project is a terminology. We have a common terminology database called IATE, Interactive Terminology for Europe, which also have a public version. So on that link you see there, or you just go and search on the internet for IATE, you will come to the public version of IATE, where you have terminology in 23 languages. Not all terms in all languages, but as far as it is. Which is updated by our respective terminology teams, added terminology, etc. Very useful. The last point I wanted to mention on technology is machine translation. I understood there was a certain interest to know where are we with machine translation. Are we going to hire any translators anymore? Or are we just going to send it through Google Translate or whatever to get it done? We're not there yet, so don't worry. Now, machine translation, we don't use it officially in the workflow today. We do know that certain of our colleagues use Google Translate or Bing Translate, but they are not supposed to do that. We are working on our own machine translation system together with the European Commission. There's a bigger part in this. The idea, and we will probably never be there, that we will replace our translators. The thing is perhaps to be able to do it a bit quicker, to get somewhere. I mean, today already when you work in the translator's workbench with the translation memories, you get proposals back on what have been translated before. The idea is to integrate machine translation when we have a decent system as a second step. So you get the results back, the hits from the translation memories. If there is a segment which don't find any matches, you will go to machine translation to get a proposal for that. There is a worry, of course, and I can understand it, that our translators say, oh, are we only becoming post editors? Are we not, really translating? But we are far from that part today still. We are, there are for certain document types, because we have a lot of repetitive text, for certain document types and for certain language combinations, we might see a bit more use for machine translations. That's what our engineers are saying for the moment, but we are not fully fledged there yet. Our idea, when we have our own system, is to make it available also to the rest of the staff of the Parliament, so that our members of Parliament, etc., can use it, to perhaps lower the burden of us to say they won't send certain things to translation which they get it out of the system and they can see at least what it's about on their part. So the idea is to open up another service also. Now, why are our translators not supposed to use Google Translate, for instance? And I'm not sure if you heard this, that was our engineers, and said, have you read the terms of service of Google? I said, no. So I did. And I just want to quote a bit of it because it's quite fantastic. So everything you type, you have all seen Google Translate. I'm sure you used it, I've also used it. You type things in there and it's sent off and you get something back which is more or less good. However, in paragraph 11.1 of Google's terms of service says, by submitting, posting or displaying the content, you give Google a perpetual, irrevocable, worldwide, royalty-free and non-exclusive license to reproduce, adapt, modify, translate, publish, publicly perform, publicly display and distribute any content which you submit, post or display on or through the services. That's pretty heavy. That's exactly why we don't want our translators to use it, and why we try to tell other people working in the parliament, say, it's very good, but watch out, there's everything you put in there is basically available to anybody, or could be, so you shouldn't put any secret notes in there or anything like that. And this is also part why we are working on our own machine translation system. Machine translation systems are also get better if you feed them the corpus of the kind of material you want them to have. So that's what the results are. Now this is just a brief overview of what we use in technology. We could go into anything which is in there, but it is heavy use of CAT tools, computer assisted translation tools, and we continue to be. We do have a slight generation shift amongst our translators. Translators approaching retirement age are quite resistant to start using them. The younger translators who start, they start immediately, or they expect the tools to be there when they translate, so it makes it a bit difficult sometimes to accept. Okay. Let me just show you an example of a typical legislative text in the Parliament. Now, the Commission in the European Union system, the Commission is the ones who do all the proposals. They send it on to the Parliament, so the Parliament can give their opinion. So the Parliament will do a report. So the Parliament will ask the Committee A, let's say it's the Fisheries Committee, to do a report. They might also ask another committee, let's say Transport Committee, and the third committee, the Energy Committee, to give an opinion to this. So they start doing a draft report. I told you there was the MEP who got the task to do a report. He does. So he ends up with a draft report and draft opinion in the other committees. These texts are all translated into 22 languages. Now, in the parliamentary committee, the other members then have the right to propose changes, to make amendments. So, everybody writes amendments to the report and write amendments to the opinions. These amendments are translated into 22 languages. Then we have a vote in the committee. So some amendments are adopted, some amendments fall, meaning we have translated them for nothing, basically. These amendments, the changes are then integrated into the draft report, and you end up with a final report. That means that we have to reuse the draft report, and we reuse the translations of the amendments we used before. Now this is where it shows that translation memories are very useful for us. Of course, it's very important that if you have a paragraph in a text which looks like this in one translation, in the next one it should be the same thing. So it's not only about productivity, but also about consistency, that the text looks the same. Same procedure for the opinions, amendments, some fall, so on. So we have a final report from that committee, Fisheries Committee. Now, this is now going up to the plenary, so the full Parliament. This time, all members of the Parliament can propose changes, amendments. These amendments, in their turn, are translated into 22 languages. And what we also notice that some amendments which were not accepted in the committee might return, in fact, here. So that's very good to have it in the translation memories, after all. Now, in the plenary, in the whole parliament, there is then a vote on these amendments. Some are adopted, some fall, and then you produce an adopted text, which is the final document which we do. Again, which is a combination of the final report and the amendments. So this is to show you that we have a lot of repeating text. Reuse is very useful, and that's why for us translation memories is a very useful thing, because they repeat themselves all the way. Now this is what we call the first reading. For certain types, depending on what subject it is, you might have a second reading or a third reading in the parliament where the same subject, the same text comes back in some form, so it's very useful to have it all in the translation memories. So this would be a typical legislative procedure. Okay. Short words about quality control, which we of course try to do as much as possible. We have, of course, conflict between our translators, wanting to do the best quality they ever can, which is good. On the other hand, we have on the other side deadlines. And you have to find a good balance between the two, because in a political organization, if the finished version of the text is not available for the committee meeting when it's supposed to be voted, there won't be a vote. So you can block the whole procedure. So we have to get out the text in time, but we also have to try to give the best quality we can. Just mentioning some of the terminology we use, which is not the same everywhere. Revision means basically that somebody else, another translator, rereads and goes through the text sentence by sentence, checking everything, basically doing a second translation, if you like. When we talk about the rereading, another translator will read the translation, but only go back to the source text when he sees something strange. He says, wait a minute, I have to go back and check. Checking is checking punctuations, dates, etc., which is often done by assistants in our case. Evaluation, we talk about evaluation when we're checking external translation, freelance agencies. And we also talk about something called spot checks, which is longer term to try to evaluate the long-term development of the quality of the in-house translators. So we try to do this. For important documents, it's done all the time. For other documents, it depends on the time, how much time we have. Well, finally, a couple of words on recruitment. What kind of translators are we looking for in our organization? Now, for all the European institutions, not only the European Parliament, all selection is done by something called the EPSO, the European Personnel Selection Office. All recruitment is done by something which is dreaded, which is called competitions, which is a procedure where you will be asked to do a number of written tests in different stages. If you pass the written tests, you will be asked to do oral exams, and if you pass those exams, you will then end up on a list of successful candidates, from which then the institutions recruit the people. You see a web page there. That is a web page of the EPSO, the European Personnel Selection Office. That's for anybody who might be interested, where you find all the information on the recruitment procedure, what is required, what is a competition. They have sample tests on what does a competition look like, and stuff like that there. So that is basically the ID. We are also, I will come back to the requirements. I just want to mention that we're also in the European Parliament and in the European Commission, we have traineeships, which are normally open also only for EU citizens. In the European Parliament, we have 3 months translation traineeships going in 4 turns over the year, so we have trainees in-house all the time. In our case, they are paid. They are not well paid, but they are paid enough to go around, to make it work. And traineeships for the Commission look slightly different, but if anybody is interested, if you search on the websites of the European Parliament or the European Commission, you will find all the criteria or how to apply, etc. Now, for staff translators, what do we require to be able to do a competition? You have to be a citizen of an EU member state, of the, for the moment, 27 member states. You have to have a university degree, bachelor level at the least. Your degree does not necessarily have to be in translation or in linguistics or in languages. You can have a bachelor in theology or in chemistry or in economy. You have the right to do the competition. In fact, in a team, as I said, between 30 and 35 translators in a unit, you want actually a good mix of people. You do want the core who are trained translators, etc. But it's very good to have somebody who has extra knowledge about law or about economics. Sometimes we end up translating legislation on chemical substances. So if you have somebody who knows a bit more about that, it would be very good. So a bachelor's degree, but it doesn't really matter what it is. And you need, as it's formulated, a thorough knowledge of 2 additional EU languages. That, of course, when I talk about additional languages, means that the first and foremost is your mother tongue, or main language. I know it is used here. We have a big discussion in the EU whether it's mother tongue or main language, because it was discriminatory calling it mother tongue somewhere, so we're not talking about main language. Anyway, your mother tongue has to be very good, because you are expected to translate into your language all the time. So that is the very important part. And then you need 2 other EU languages which you can translate out of. It doesn't mean that you have to speak them fluently, but you have to be good enough to translate correctly out of them. That's the criteria. Now, in principle, it's any 2 EU languages. In the practice, though, for each competition, EPSO can make certain requirements and say, okay, we need, out of those 2 languages, 1 should be English, French, and German. That's a very common requirement, because those are the big languages. Actually, if I, as a Swede, come and pass a competition and say, I have Maltese and Estonian, it's all very good, but I'm pretty useless in the organization, because we have so few pages of those languages. So you would be required to have 1 of the people languages, English, French, and German, sometimes even 2 of them. Okay, I spoke a bit longer than I thought, but we're happy to take any questions you have. Let's see, we have somebody with a microphone over here to help our interpreters. Any questions? Raise your hand. There's one.
Just a question about the relay languages. How do you choose between the 3 of them? When you use one of the relay languages, how do you decide if it's going to be German, English, or French?
I mean, if I understood it correctly, so how, between these 3 relay languages, which are the most important ones, or?
Well, no, so if you need to translate something, as you're saying, from Maltese to Estonian, and you have to pass it through 1 relay language, how do you decide which one it's going to be?
Okay. Well, when you do the competition, particularly for one of these 3 languages, they look a bit on what they are lacking. We have to, every year from each institutions, we have to tell what would we like to have to EPSO. And we say, okay, in our English unit, we don't have anybody doing Lithuanian, we need somebody with Lithuanian. Then you have 2 options. Otherwise, if there's a competition coming up, you will tell them, okay, please put in the notice of the competition that one of the languages should be Lithuanian, or you train somebody in the unit to have Lithuanian. But it's, today we have those people, so that's not so important. I mean, usually requirements are English, French, or German, or 1 of them or 2 of them, and the other language is free. But it depends on the need, so it's not the same every time. Other questions?
I have a question about laws that are translated. Do all of the translations have legal validity, or is it just a source text?
Yes, I didn't go into that today because I will actually, you might know I was speaking on Thursday also more of that. But yes, if we have we translate legislation, we have basically two types of legislation. I'm simplifying a bit. One is called directives, which are then transposed into national law. So the EU says, okay, here is a directive, make sure it comes into your legislation one way or another. How you do it is up to you, but you have to transpose it into your legislation. The other type is called regulations, and they become legislation in each member state as they are. When they are adopted in the Parliament, the Greek version, as it leaves the Parliament, becomes legislation in Greece. The Swedish version becomes legislation in Sweden, etc. Which means that yes, at that point in time, you don't have one original and 22 translations, you have 23 originals, if you like. We're talking about the equal validity, etc. Now, this is the principle. I know that when the courts in the different countries then start using them, they tend to look at other language versions and see if there is something which corresponds. But that's why it's so important that these versions are correct, because they do in fact become legislation in each member state. That's how it is. More questions? Yes.
The candidates who go through the competition, when they're hired, they become European Parliament employees? Or are these the freelance? Or are they two separate?
The competitions are our staff translators, so it's a permanent hired by the European Parliament. So the freelance is only via the calls for tenders, and where we only use agencies and not individuals, in fact, in that case. So doing through the competitions, it's only staff permanent translators. You will find, though, sometimes for certain categories when we need people urgently, we can also recruit something called contractual agents. These are hired for a maximum time of 3 years. It can be 1 year, it can be 2 years, maximum 3 years. And actually, next month, this month, 25th of October, I think, they will launch CAST, as they call it, for translators into all languages, which is very unusual that they do. So, as of that date, that will also be done by EPSO, so it's the same web page where one should register and look for the information. But that is contractual agents, and it's not called a competition, it's called a CAST selection tests or something like that. So it's not really called competition, but it's, then it's for a shorter period of time.
Question, Ken, about languages that are not official EU languages. Does the Parliament ever have a need to contract the services of translators from other languages, say Korean, Chinese, Japanese, and is there international outreach in parliamentary body?
We do translate a number of texts out of other languages. Typical example, when I was in planning, I know we had this, and this was, well, let's say 9 years ago, so not too far away from 9/11. And suddenly in the President's Office of the Parliament, something comes in on the fax, which nobody could read. And everybody getting very stressed, sending it on to us, and we were just looking at it and saying, we don't know what this is either. Which showed up to be Farsi in the end, language in Iran. And, I mean, this is a rare case, but that we had. Then we used our contacts through the agencies with which we already have a contract. We try to find a way to find a translator through them. We have our in-house capacity in those languages is very, in other languages are very small. For certain languages we have a very good coverage from Russian. For historical reasons we have individual translators who can do from Arabic, or Arabic, but it's not also very rare. We do not do like our interpreters. I know we're looking for people who can do this on a more permanent basis. For, let's say, when the Parliament invites somebody to come and speak, and then they invite an Arab leader or somebody from Medvedev or whoever comes to Parliament and speaks, they are, of course, not expected to speak in any but their own language, and then we need, in particular, interpreters to be able to do this. But we do not have much in translation, the way of translation. There might be a letter from the president thanking Medvedev that he was in the parliament or whatever, which we have to translate into Russian, but it's actually quite rare. It's quite rare. We don't do it much. We don't do it much. So we're not actively looking for the capacity for that. I know in the Commission it's slightly different because they have a lot more contacts to the external world in the diplomatic service. So they now, I know they are more looking at that a bit more in detail. But in Parliament we don't have.
One of the microphones here, I might as well ask a question. I'm very interested in the quality control process, and I'm wondering, is this a tool support or is it a purely human activity? And I'm particularly interested in how exactly, or where exactly is editing performed. Is it in the final document, or are reviewers using a translation method? And so, to be precise, when you review a document, do you review the target document and then update the translation memory, or is the review entirely the translation memory? Another question: are you using any metrics or standards to guide the editing process?
Now we're touching the fringe of what I actually know here, but it's good answer as I can. I mean, we have a quality manual, which will cover a lot of this, for which types of documents we are expected to do. If I said before, mentioned regulations, which are actually become legislation in each member state, where we expect to produce the best quality we can. And there is then very strict, and you say, okay, for this, it should be then revised by a senior translator, like that. How it's actually done differs slightly from each translation unit, we're trying to change because it's difficult to develop tools if people tend to do it differently. Normally they would do it manually. Those I know would do the revision manually and put the changes in the text. This, however, and that's very important, would then by an assistant be typed up and aligned and sent up to the translation memory. So you have the latest version which actually leaves our translation services in the translation memory. This is a very important part that those changes come in there. But for the process itself, there is no real tool to do it. No, it's done manually. It's done manually. Even though they could do it in the workbench, and there might be people who do it, but it's not. As far as I know, it's not the normal case. But as I said, very important, that's pushed very hard that all the latest changes actually are sent up to the translation memory. So that you don't have a case where you did some changes to the draft report, but they were actually never sent up to the translation memory, so when you do the final report, the matches you get are the ones which were not revised. I think that's where you wanted to find that. Yes. No.
What are the recruitment exams like? Are you happy with them?
Well, I don't have anybody from EPSO here listening to me, so we are not, I mean, we have slightly different ideas to personnel selection office on how to do them. And the principle is okay, because what happens for most languages is that we get so many candidates, and this is not only for translator and interpreters, it's for all other categories, Parliament, or in the European institution. We have so many candidates, so you need some kind of procedure to filter down. What our translators, at least, always complain about is there is one test which is called verbal and numerical reasoning. kind of IQ test. You're going to fold little boxes in your head and to make sure. And this is dreaded by our translators, and some will say, why should our linguists be doing this? Reason is that if you start your career as a translator or as an interpreter in the parliament, you end up in a category called AD, which is short for administrators. Which means that basically you can, if you're in the system as a translator, then apply for another job as, let's say, an administrator in the Fisheries Committee. And so you're expected to have some of those skills with you. So therefore you're not only tested on your language skill or your translation skills, but also on a set of more general skills. What we have, the most we have had to complain about is that EPSO does, when they do a list, when they do a competition, for certain languages, they don't, the end result is that there's not enough people on those lists. They're not testing enough people. We've also had some complaints about saying, for us, the mother tongue is very important. If you do all other competitions for assistant or for an administrator, you usually have to do most of them in English, French, or German. But we are saying, well, we need to test how good people are in their mother tongue. Because that's what we actually are going to work with. For an administrator, in other places, you hardly ever work in your mother tongue. So what we have asked, for instance, say, okay, let's do this verbal and numerical reasoning, not in English, French, and German, but they should be doing that in their mother tongue so that we can see that they understand that. So that's where we have slightly different opinions. And for certain languages, we get far too few candidates coming out. We have certain languages where we have a bit of a generation shift. We have a lot of people retiring at the same time. We simply don't get enough candidates on them. But this is being worked on. EPSO changed their system radically in 2010, so the procedure as such is much quicker than it used to be, because before you could do competition, it could take 2 years, and then you could be on the list for 3 years before somebody finally called and said, we might have a job for you. And then many people said, well, sorry, I have another career in the meantime, I'm interested. So now EPSO has obliged themselves to do a circle, which is the competition and the recruitment procedure should take maximum 1 year. So if you pass the competition, you're on the list, you should be offered a job if there are jobs within 1 year, and then there's a new circle, which is better than the old system.
I actually have 2 questions. The first one is, you mentioned that there are a couple of languages which are highly sought after at the moment. Could you please name these languages, and especially which language combinations? And the second question, or should I wait?
Yeah.
The second question is, how do you deal with people who apply, but their A language might be another language than their mother tongue? So they, for example, I'm a Hungarian citizen, but my A language is German because I grew up in Germany. So would you categorize them as A language native speakers, or? Thank you.
Well, I'll start with the second question, in fact. You can apply for anything. I, being Swedish mother tongue, I could apply for doing a competition as a Finnish translator. I don't speak a word of Finnish, which is that. I could do that. I wouldn't go through the competition, but you have the right to do it. Experience shows that very, very few actually passes the competition, which is not for their mother tongue. There are some who actually makes it through, but it's more an exception. But you have the possibility to do it. And the first question, I've forgotten it in the meantime, my age.
Language combinations, which are sought after.
The languages and language combinations sought after. Well, for the moment, we have problems finding English translators. I know the interpreters have a bit the same problem. We have the reason being, for instance, in the UK, they don't study languages the way they used to. We've also seen cuts in the expenditure for language studies, also at university level. If they study translation, and you have, translation programs, many of them only study one language, and we require two, which is a bit of an obstacle. So English, which we expect to keep on being a problem for a while. For the moment, then we have more local problems on temporary, which is for the moment Dutch. I mentioned Dutch because we have a lot of Dutch translators retiring at the moment. So they're not coming in as fast as they're leaving for the moment, but that will eventually be a problem anymore. It's a bit the same thing about Danish, with retirements. For certain groups, and Danish belongs to that, they might look at our conditions and salary, and they might look at first glance, and they say, nah, it's not that interesting. And it's true that the starting salaries has gone down, but if you look over a whole career, it's still a very interesting package. But for certain countries, depending on where you are, but for Copenhagen, it's a very expensive town to live in, etc. And if you just look at the figures, you might hesitate. Slovenian is a problem. We get the translators. It's a small country, so it's a small population to look for translators in. Where many Slovenians coming to live in Brussels or in Luxembourg, and they say it's rainy and cold, it's nicer in Slovenia, so they move back. Very common. And then we have the really, really small populations like Maltese, Malta. You have a population of 250,000 people, and they didn't really used to have a tradition of translation and interpretation studies. So there we have big problems. In the meantime, they joined in 2004. Now we're finally getting somewhere with Maltese. So those are typical problem languages. Other languages we don't really have any problems finding enough good people, like French or German, Spanish, Polish, the big languages. So it depends a bit on the size and it depends a bit on the generation.
Well, we would just like to thank Kent for that and give him a warm round of applause. And Professor Cordova Serrano has simply asked that one express our thanks for a very interesting lecture. It was something that opened my eyes to a lot of what goes on behind the scenes and how complicated it actually is to keep everything functioning with that many languages. I would just wrap up by saying thank you for being here and remind you that this coming Thursday evening at 7 p.m. here in the Irvine Auditorium, Ken will be speaking again, but will be shifting his focus from the nuts and bolts that we heard about today to a broader topic of how multilingualism has become a pillar of European democracy and how the policy of allowing members of the European Union to be able to speak their mother tongue, to be able to understand and follow what's going on in their legislative body has become a key element to strengthening the European Union and allowing citizens to be able to participate in the democracy. So we hope you can join us at 7 p.m. this coming Thursday, and please spread the word and have a wonderful afternoon.